They said nobody wanted the widow. Said her hips were too wide for a respectable woman, and her spirit too stubborn for a grieving one. They called her barren, cursed, left for broke in a cabin at the edge of Pine Hollow, and for a long time, the town was right. Nobody made an offer, until the lumberjack came. Before we get into this story, do me a favor and hit that like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. The rain started at dawn and never quit. It was a cold, miserable soaking that turned the road to slop and her small yard into a pit of thick brown mud. The whole world smelled like wet pine and rot. Clarice pulled her thin shawl tighter, but it was already soaked through, doing nothing to stop the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She gripped the axe handle, her knuckles white and aching. The block of wood on the chopping stump was a monster, a gnarled beast of oak she could barely wrap her arms around. But she had no choice. The nights were getting colder. The wind found every crack in the cabin walls, and the old iron stove ate wood like a starving animal. Her woodpile was almost nothing. This one stubborn stump was all that stood between her and freezing. She raised the axe high, her arms shaking, and brought it down with everything she had. The blade bit into the wood with a dull thud, but only an inch deep. The impact sent a painful jolt up her arms. She winced, muttering a curse, and yanked the axe free. She swung again. This time, the axe head glanced off a knot with a sickening crack, and the handle twisted in her grip. She almost dropped it. She stood there, panting, the cold rain dripping from her hair and running down her face. It wasn't just the work that made her jaw ache. It was the anger, a hot, simmering rage that was always there. She was angry at the Price family, her dead husband's kin, who smiled at her wedding and turned their backs the day after the funeral. They were the ones who started the whispers, telling everyone she was barren, a curse on their family name. She was angry at the women in town who would turn their backs, and angry at the men who didn't. The ones who looked at her not as a widow, but as a problem, a temptation. A wagon rattled on the road. Her head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. She clutched the axe like a weapon. It was just a man driving a load of fresh-cut boards toward the mill. He sat tall on the bench, his shoulders broad under a heavy oilskin coat, the brim of his hat pulled low. He glanced toward the cabin, his gaze passing over her. He didn't slow down. When the road was empty again, she looked at the monstrous log. Her arms were shaking too hard to try again. Defeated, she let it fall into the mud. She gathered the few small pieces she had managed to split and went inside. The air in the cabin was thick with smoke and damp wool. She knelt by the stove and carefully added the last of her dry wood. The flames licked at it slowly. She sat on the edge of her simple cot and stared at the small, bare room. One table, one chair, a few shelves holding what little food she had left. Some nights, she told herself this life was a testament to her strength, but other nights, like this one, it just felt like a punishment. Tomorrow, she would have to go back out there. Tomorrow, she would split that stump, even if it tore her hands to pieces. She had to. Because if she didn't, the cold would take her before the hunger did, and she refused to give the Price family the satisfaction. The rain finally let up before dawn, but the world outside was still heavy and slick with mud. Clara stepped out early, her breath a white cloud. She walked straight to the chopping stump, her jaw set. Today, she would conquer the log. The stove was nearly cold. There was no choice. She gripped the axe, planting her boots firmly in the sucking mud. She had to get this done before anyone from town came down the road, but she was too late. She heard the hoofbeats first, slow and steady. The wagon came into view over the small rise. It was him, the same man from yesterday. He pulled his team to a stop just outside her dilapidated fence. The man climbed down without a word, his heavy boots sinking into the mud. Clara's chest went tight. Strangers didn't stop here. But this man? He didn't have that cruel, hungry look she was used to. His face was rough, weathered, a faint white scar running from his temple down into his short dark beard. He gave her a single quiet nod. Then his eyes fell to the axe in her hands and the log at her feet. "Morning," he said. His voice was a low rumble. Clara swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Morning." He didn't waste time. He walked straight to the stump, bent down, and set the log back in place as if it weighed nothing. Then he held out his hand for the axe. Clara hesitated. Pride rose in her chest. She hated feeling small, hated admitting she needed help, but her hands ached, and she was tired, so bone-tired. She gave him the axe. He swung once. The blade sank deep into the wood. The second swing split the log clean in two. Clara blinked, stunned. "That one's been sitting there near a week," she said before she could stop herself. He didn't answer. He just stacked the two halves neatly near her porch and came back for another log. He worked with an easy, practiced strength, splitting 4 massive logs without another word. He stacked each piece neatly until a respectable pile of firewood stood by her door. Then he set the axe upright in the chopping block. "That ought to last you a bit," he said. Clara crossed her arms. She wasn't used to men doing anything for free. "You didn't have to do that." "No," he agreed, and turned back to his wagon. She stood on the porch, waiting for him to ask for something. A hot meal, a drink, something more. But he just climbed back onto the wagon bench and rolled away down the muddy road. Clara stood there long after he was gone, leaving her with a woodpile higher than it had been since her husband was alive. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why he'd stopped. But for the first time in weeks, she thought maybe she wouldn't freeze before the first snow. Later that day, at the general store, she heard his name, Levi Rohr. The man behind the counter was telling a story. Levi had been with the North logging crew until last spring. A log chain had snapped, they said, crushing another man's leg. Levi had been the one to dig him out and carry him 2 miles to the camp doctor. Saved his life. Folks said Levi took it hard, blamed himself. After that, he'd changed. He stopped drinking with the crew, moved out of the bunkhouse and kept to himself. A man haunted by a ghost that wasn't his own. Clara listened quietly, pretending to be interested in a barrel of nails. She didn't understand why her chest felt so tight hearing the story. It was just a man, just a pile of wood. But as she walked home, she knew it was more than that. The neat stack of wood was a silent testament to something she hadn't felt in a long time. That night, as the rain hammered the roof, she lay in her cot and thought about him, about how he had done it without asking for thanks, without asking for anything at all, and for the first time in a very long time, she wondered if he might come back. She didn't have to wonder for long. The world was shrouded in a thick, cold mist when she woke. She stared at the empty chopping stump and felt that familiar dread. She would have to drag another heavy round over, would have to fight with it until her hands were torn open again. Then she heard it, the steady creak of wagon wheels. Her stomach did a strange little flip. She stood her ground and watched the wagon crest the rise. It was him, Levi Rohr. He climbed down. This time, he had a bundle of fresh-cut boards and a sack of nails. He gave her the same small nod and walked toward the chopping block as if this was just what he did now. Clara crossed her arms. "I didn't ask you to come back." "No," he said simply, picking up her axe. A part of her wanted to send him away, but the words caught in her throat. She just stepped back onto the porch and let him work. He worked with a quiet, focused precision that was mesmerizing. "You always do this?" she asked. He paused. "Do what?" "Show up at folks' places and start swinging their axe." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Not usually." "Then why?" she pressed. He kept working, stacking the wood near her porch until the pile was twice as high. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even. "You're going to run out before the month is over." Clara's throat tightened. She hated that he was right. I can take care of myself. He set the axe down and met her eyes. I can see that, he said. And there was something in his voice, a quiet note of respect, that disarmed her. He turned and went back to his wagon without another word. Later that day, she walked into town for flour. The general store was crowded. As soon as she walked in, the chatter dropped to a low murmur. Clara kept her chin high, pretending not to hear the woman who whispered "lumberjack's widow" just loud enough to catch. She paid for her flour and turned to leave. Just as she reached the door, it swung open, and Levi walked in. The room went quieter still. He nodded to her, a simple, public acknowledgement that sent a ripple of shock through the room. It was enough to set every tongue in Pine Hollow wagging. When she got back to the cabin, she slammed the sack of flour on the table. She wasn't angry at Levi. She was angry at the town, at the way they watched her like vultures. Near sundown, she heard the wagon wheels again. She almost didn't open the door. But she did. There he was, with more boards. "This your fence?" he asked, nodding toward a collapsed section. Yes. He didn't wait for an invitation. He took the boards and started patching the gap. Clara found herself outside, holding the lantern for him as the light faded. By the time he was done, night had fallen. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said suddenly. He stopped, one hand on the wagon wheel, and looked back at her. "I know." And then he was gone. She stood outside for a long time, his silence, his work, turning over and over in her mind. When she finally went inside, the cabin felt a little less empty. By the third morning, Clara stopped pretending she wasn't waiting for him. She rose before dawn and had coffee brewing. When he arrived, he carried 2 fresh posts and a hammer. "You missed a spot," he said, nodding toward another section of the fence. "I know. Wasn't sure how to set a new post without another pair of hands. Good thing I brought mine." They worked side by side. He dug the post holes while she cleared the rocks. At one point, their fingers brushed as he took a nail from her palm. She flinched, but he just held her gaze for a long second before turning back to his work. When the last post was firm, she heard herself say, "Coffee's on." He hesitated, then gave a slight nod and followed her inside. His presence seemed to fill the small room. "You always this helpful?" she asked. "No," he said flatly. "Then why me?" The question slipped out. He held her gaze over his coffee mug. Saw a woman trying to split a stump twice her size, figured she could use a hand. "That's it?" "That's it." The story of Levi Rohr having coffee in the widow's cabin spread like wildfire. A woman at the store cornered her. "Is it true, dear? Have you finally got a man calling on you?" Clara ignored her, but her cheeks burned all the way home. She thought he might not come back after that. But just before dark, his wagon rolled up the road. "Fence hold?" he asked. "Yes." He started to leave, but she heard herself say, "You're wet through. There's still coffee." He paused, then turned and came up the steps. Inside, the fire cast a warm glow. "You don't have to come every day," she said. "I know." "Then why do you?" He stared into his cup. When he looked up, there was no hesitation. "Because I want to." Clara's throat went tight. No man had ever spoken to her so plainly. "Roof looks weak on the north side," he said, his voice practical again. "I know. I can bring shingles tomorrow." Clara just nodded, her heart beating a little harder. When he left, she stood by the window and watched until the darkness swallowed his wagon. For the first time in a very long time, she didn't dread tomorrow. He arrived the next morning with shingles and a hammer. The sky was clear, a pale, washed-out blue. He worked with a steady rhythm, tearing off the rotten shingles and replacing them one by one. She found herself moving closer, holding the nails for him. When he came down, she said, "You should come in. Wash up." Inside, She set a basin of water on the table. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing thick, corded forearms. Clara caught herself staring and quickly looked away. "You don't talk much," she said. "No reason to," he said, scrubbing the grime from his hands. "Most men find plenty of reason." He glanced at her, water dripping from his fingers. "Most men talk too much." Clara's lips twitched. It wasn't a smile, but it was close. By mid-afternoon, the patch was complete. "You should eat before you go," she said. She ladled rabbit stew into 2 bowls. They ate in a settled, comfortable silence. "You can let me pay you," she said after a while. Levi set his spoon down. "Not here for pay." "Then what are you here for?" He held her gaze. "Because I want to be," he said again. But the words carried more weight this time. "You keep showing up," she said, her voice a whisper. "I will," he answered. There was a promise in those 2 words that terrified and thrilled her. After he left, she sat by the fire, his words echoing in her mind. "I will." The next day, the gossip in town had sharpened. A woman asked if she'd found a man to do her chores for her now. Clara ignored her, but her cheeks burned all the way home. When Levi came that evening, she told him what they'd said. He stood on her porch, his face unreadable. "Let them talk. You know why I'm here. And I know why I'm here. That's all that matters." Clara stared at him, the simple logic of his words cutting through her anger. She stepped back from the door. "Come in." The fire was throwing off a steady heat. For the first time, she didn't feel like a woman waiting for the world to crash down on her. She felt like she had an ally. He paused by the door before he left. "You're safe here, Clarice." Her throat tightened. It was the first time he'd used her name. "I know." That night, she slept deeply, without dreams. She didn't listen for footsteps on the road or fear a knock on the door. But safety in Pine Hollow was a fragile thing, and the storm that was coming had nothing to do with the weather. The next morning, Levi arrived, and he wasn't alone. Another man sat beside him, thin and older, with a wheezing cough. "This is Thomas," Levi said. "Heard you might have a leak in your well pump." Clara stared. "I didn't say anything about the pump." "I noticed it yesterday," Levi said. "Handle was sticking. It was unsettling the way he saw everything, but she let them work." While Thomas tinkered with the pump, Levi reinforced the walls of her animal shed. He was different today, tense. He kept glancing down the road as if expecting someone. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He stopped, hammer in hand. She saw a flicker of worry in his eyes. "Just be careful today. Stay close to the cabin." Before he could explain, another wagon appeared on the road. It was a heavy freight wagon, and the men driving it were Jedediah and Caleb Price, her brothers-in-law. Levi's whole body went rigid. He set the hammer down slowly and stood up, placing himself between Clara and the wagon. Jedediah pulled the wagon to a halt in her yard. He was a big man, running to fat, with a cruel mouth. His eyes took in the repaired fence, the patched roof, the stacked firewood, and then landed on Levi. A slow, mocking sneer spread across his face. "Well, well, Clarice," he said, his voice oily and loud. "Looks like you finally found some help. Or did you just replace my brother that quickly?" "This ain't your business, Price," Levi said, his voice a low growl. Jedediah laughed. "Everything on this land is my business, Roar. You of all people should know that." He turned to Clara, his smile vanishing. "The family has decided to make you a final offer for this piece of dirt." It wasn't an offer. It was an ultimatum. "I'm not selling," Clara said, her voice shaking but firm. "The only bad luck here is you," Levi said, taking a step forward. Jedediah's eyes narrowed. He slid down from the wagon. "You should have stayed out of this, Roar. You should have learned your lesson last time." He took a step toward Levi, then stopped and looked directly at Clara, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. You should have learned your lesson when your husband was taken from you. Some things are better left buried. The words hung in the cold air. What lesson? What did he mean, buried? A cold dread washed over Clara. This wasn't just about land. This was about something else. Something that had cost her husband his life. And she had a terrible, sinking feeling that the quiet man standing in front of her knew exactly what it was. The Prices left, their threats lingering like poison. Clara turned to Levi, her eyes wide. "You knew him," she whispered. "You knew my husband." Levi didn't deny it. "I worked with him, at the North Camp." He paused. "I was there, Clarice, the day he died." The air left her lungs. "Tell me what happened." He recounted the official story, the one Jedediah had told her. A worn cable, a log breaking free, a tragic accident. But his words were hollow. The haunted guilt in his eyes told her it was a lie. "It wasn't an accident, was it?" He didn't answer. He just looked at her, his face a mask of torment. "Jedediah wants this land. He won't stop until he gets it. You need to be careful." That night, sleep was impossible. Some things are better left buried. She thought back to the weeks before her husband Daniel's death. He had been quiet, worried. He had started carrying a pistol. And he had developed a nervous habit, tapping his foot on one of the floorboards, always the same spot. An instinct seized her. She got out of her cot, grabbed the iron poker, and went to the spot. She pried at the board. It groaned, then splintered and came loose. Underneath, nestled in the dirt, was a small, rusted tin box. Her hands shook as she carried it to the table. Inside, resting on dried leaves, was a folded piece of paper. A letter from Daniel. "My dearest Clarice, if you are reading this, then Jedediah has done his worst. He wants this land. He has been sabotaging the equipment here at the camp. I fear for my life." Clara sobbed, pressing a hand to her mouth. She forced herself to read on. "I have told another man about my fears. His name is Levi Rohr. He's a good man, quiet, but I trust him. If something happens to me, he knows the truth." The letter fell from her fingers. Levi. He knew. He had known this entire time. His kindness wasn't random. It was guilt. She picked up the letter, her eyes scanning the last lines. "The proof is hidden away. It's where the North Star shines brightest through the wall. Trust Levi. He will help you." Her blood ran cold. He hadn't just been helping a widow. He had been guarding a secret that could get them both killed. The next morning, when his wagon approached, she felt a knot of anger and betrayal. She met him on the porch, the letter clutched in her hand. "You lied to me," she said, her voice flat. "Every single day." He saw the tin box on the table behind her and his face crumbled. "I didn't know what to do," he said, his voice raw. "Daniel made me promise to look out for you, after he died. Jedediah came to me. He said if I ever breathed a word, I'd end up in a ditch just like my friend." The story poured out of him. Broken by his friend's death and terrified of the Prices, he had retreated into himself. Watching her struggle, his guilt eating him alive, chopping her wood, fixing her fence. It was his penance. "He said you would help me," Clara said, the anger draining away. "The letter says the proof is where the North Star shines brightest through the wall." Together, they searched. On the north-facing wall, there was a single dark knot in one of the logs. As the sun began to set, a single bright beam of light shone through the knothole, projecting a brilliant spot onto the opposite wall. A star. Levi pried at the wood around the knot. It was a plug. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small leather pouch. Inside were 2 documents: the deed to the land, in her name alone, and a small ledger. Daniel's handwriting filled the pages, detailing every act of sabotage, every threat Jedediah had made. It was a damning record of premeditated murder. They had it. The proof. As the reality washed over them, a new sound cut through the quiet. It wasn't one wagon. It was several. And they were coming fast. Levi looked out the window, his face grim. "It's the Prices," he said. "And they're not alone." The cabin door burst open. Jedediah Price stood there, his face flushed with rage, his brothers and 2 thugs from the mill flanking him. They'd come for the proof. "Hand it over, Roar," Jedediah snarled. "Get out of her house," Levi said, his voice calm, pushing Clara behind him. The room exploded into violence. Levi was strong, but it was 5 against 1. A table went over with a crash. Caleb Price caught Levi from behind, wrapping his arms around his neck. "Run, Clarice! Get out!" Levi yelled. But she didn't run. A fire surged through her. This was her home. They had taken her husband. They would not take this. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth. While Levi fought, Jedediah lunged for the pouch. At the same moment, Clara swung the poker with all her might. It connected with Jedediah's shoulder. He screamed in pain and outrage. "He murdered my husband!" Clara shrieked, her voice carrying out the open door. "Jedediah Price is a murderer! Help! Somebody help!" The commotion had not gone unnoticed. Lantern lights began to bob in the distance as neighbors, drawn by the sounds of the fight, started to emerge. Realizing they'd lost, Jedediah made one last lunge for Levi. But a new figure appeared in the shattered doorway, a lantern held high. It was the town sheriff, a grizzled old man named Miller. He took in the scene, the overturned furniture, Levi bleeding from a cut, and Jedediah clutching his shoulder. "She's crazy, Sheriff!" Jedediah spat. "She attacked us!" Sheriff Miller's gaze finally settled on Jedediah. He let the silence stretch. "You know, Jedediah," he said, his voice a low drawl, "I've been sheriff in this county for 30 years, and in 30 years I've learned one thing. Trouble has a way of finding the same people over and over again, and you've always been trouble." He stepped over to Levi. "You all right, son?" Levi nodded. The sheriff took the pouch, opened it, and glanced at the ledger. A grim smile touched his lips. "I've been hearing whispers about you for years, Jedediah. Whispers about what really happened to your brother." He looked up, his eyes hard as stone. "Looks like the whispers were true." He pulled out a pair of iron cuffs. Jedediah's face went pale. "Respect is earned, Jedediah, not bullied," Miller said, snapping the cuffs onto his wrist. The hired thugs put their hands up immediately. Justice, when it came, was swift. The townspeople who had gathered, who had once whispered about the cursed widow, now stared at the Price family with open contempt. The lies had been exposed. In the aftermath, the cabin was quiet again. Neighbors helped right the furniture and then left them alone in the warm glow of the firelight. Levi stood on the porch, looking out at the night. The land was truly hers now. The ghosts had been exorcised. He turned to her, his face bruised and tired, but his eyes clear for the first time. "What now?" he asked softly. Clara looked at the small cabin, her home. She looked at the quiet, steady man who had faced down his own demons to protect her. She stepped forward and took his rough, calloused hand in her own. "Now," she said, her voice full of a certainty she had not felt in years. "You stay." He squeezed her hand. And he did. He stayed through the winter and into the spring. He stayed when the snow melted and the first green shoots pushed their way through the dark earth. He stayed. The woodpile never got low again. The roof never leaked. And the woman who the town had cast aside found that her home, once a place of lonely survival, was now, finally, a place of life. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.